Joseph Campbell's work, Myths to Live By, is provocative because it introduces a number of ideas with respect to what the individual is, and this is crucial with respect to polytheism. Now, Campbell is going to insist that the Western concept of the individual is a recent thing, and he's undoubtedly correct about this, that our notion of what an individual is, and specifically what individual will is and what choice is a very recent phenomenon. And if we look back far enough in history, then that sort of conception vanishes and changes into something that is almost unrecognizably different. And so it makes it very difficult for us to identify with and understand what very ancient cultures had in mind with respect to religion, with respect to anything. The way that they lived their daily lives is somewhat enigmatic to us because of this. Now, Campbell speculates on some of this, and one of the things that he says is that the Jungian process of individuation may be relevant. Now, Campbell is perhaps not inappropriately labeled as a Jungian, and he is someone who took a great deal of influence from Jung's work, at least. And so there is a psychoanalytic bent to his work. And one might notice this specifically with respect to the way that he conceives of religion as functioning. And he thinks about it in psychological terms. And so this is something that is certainly not unfamiliar to those of you who are familiar with Jung and his attitude towards religion. Now, this separates him significantly from, just as it did with Jung, from Freud. And so the predominantly sexual connection with religion and everything else that we get in Freud is not present in Jung in the same way. And the idea of individuation is perhaps, certainly for Campbell's count, richer for that. And so we might appeal to this notion of individuation and this notion of the psyche as, consisting of different pieces and, trying to integrate different pieces in a certain way. When we think about what the individual is and has been historically. Now, one of the things that Campbell says that is particularly provocative is his speculation on the ego and the id. So the id being sensual pleasure, the ego being the identity, the I. And he says that the Orient never separated these. And so the id of sensual experience and pleasure and desire, that was never separated from the ego. Now, this is really a much more significant thesis than it might sound on the surface, in that if the id and the ego are not separated, then this doesn't allow for us to compartmentalize and to consider sensual experience as merely a portion of our identity. And instead, we can see it as something that can be transcended entirely, can be put down entirely, and if you do that, then in a substantial way you have put down what it means for you to be individual. In other words, if you have, by means of ascetic practices, meditation, what have you, done away with, annihilated the sensual experience and pleasure, then in a substantial sense as well, you have done away with the ego, with the I. Now, in the West, we don't see this in the same way typically. And historically, what I believe we see is a change in this conception. And the change is one that moves toward the modern notion of the I, which is kind of this all-encompassing thing that just never leaves, that we never get out of, we never get away from, that all experience is mediated by language and concepts and experience, and we never can get beyond and more fundamental than the I. That's really very different than what we get in the East. And Campbell's at least right in pointing out that the conceptions are quite different. And this is something that led Suzuki, for instance, to say that one cannot just straightforwardly import Buddhism into Zen, in particular he had in mind, into the United States, into the West, because these notions of the individual are so different that the tools that are going to be appropriate for the Orient are not going to be appropriate in the same way to the West. And so there's a little bit of translation, interpretation, and change that must be effected to make that system meaningful to the Western listener. And to the extent that this is the case, of course, is certainly an object of some debate. But at the very least, the notion of the individual is different enough for us to warrant some special consideration with this. So if the individual includes not only sensual experience, but all possible experience, which typically is the way that we think about it. We may not realize that this is what we're doing, but we're hemming ourselves in by saying that our notion of the I necessarily includes all possible experience. And so we cannot step outside of ourselves in any meaningful sense, even in religious experiences. And this is something that we're going to see with William James in the Varieties of Religious Experience. This is something that he'll pick on in particular in saying that in the 19th century especially, there was the notion that, these religious experiences are just pathologies, nervous pathologies of one way or another. Maybe it's a disorder of the liver or a digestive disorder or something of the kind, some kind of mundane physical cause for why it is that someone might be experiencing visions, a la George Fox or what have you. And yeah, this is really very different than the Oriental conception of the individual and the way that the East views these sorts of things. And in general, really, the way that the West viewed it until fairly recently. And so part of the challenge, I think, for us, and this is why Campbell is useful, and this is why I asked you to read him in this context, part of the challenge for us in trying to understand polytheism is to get outside of that, to be able to see what it is about our conception of the individual that really is a recent thing. And so the kind of emblem, the hallmark for this lecture, this module, is Campbell's idea that the Western conception of the individual is a recent thing. Because in proportion to how well and how clearly we see that the Western conception of the individual is a recent phenomenon, that enables us to step outside of it and help us to understand there are other possibilities out there that are not necessarily less, they are simply different. And by seeing what our own assumptions are, we can then open up the possibility of what are the variations. If this assumption is simply one possible assumption, what other assumptions might we have made? What other pieces might we have used to construct a worldview, since we realize then at that point that our piece that we are using in the form of the Western conception of the individual is not the only possibility. So this is how I see Campbell is principally useful, and his style, I think, certainly lends itself to that. And this helps us, once we have understood these things, to understand some of the examples that he provides, for instance, with respect to the absence of freedom in the way that we typically think about it with respect to the individual. So one of the examples I think that he throws out that's really provocative with respect to this is the creation story. He makes an observation that the creation story in Sanskrit you have the divine that's split, and in Genesis, in the Hebrew narrative, man is split. This is really more than a superficial difference, if Campbell's right. That if the divine is split, then the divine is the super category. So the divine is the most fundamental thing. And if man is split, then this opens the door for thinking of the ego, for thinking of the I as the most fundamental thing. Now, this creates some very interesting tension in Christian history in particular, because the church fathers in general and the monastics and certainly the mystics of various stripes have emphasized the former, in emphasizing the divine as the most fundamental, God as the most fundamental. And increasingly what we see in history is an emphasis on the individual, an emphasis on the I as the most fundamental, as the locus of all experience, as the locus of all possible experience. And so everything that we can know, we typically think about as being confined to the individual. Whereas the mystics, the church fathers, and indeed the ancient Greeks and beyond, and virtually everybody else in the world, thinks of this in terms of the divine as being the most fundamental we have come to elevate the individual to that status. Now, if you think that this is a form of hyperbole, what we see in Giordano Bruno's work, for instance, is very much this sort of thing, the elimination of Christ from the Christian context, religion, myths, what have you, and the installation of the individual in his place, and the kind of divinization of the individual in that way. And so the I becomes God in a certain fashion. And this is a shift in the way that the individual, a shift in the way that identity is thought of, that's worthy of note and study. Because this characterizes a lot of the changes that we see in religious history. So as the I, as the Western conception of the individual becomes inflated, what consequences does that have with respect to the way that we think about the divine? What room do we have for thinking about the divine if a lot of the function, ability, materiality, reality of the divine is now contained in the concept of the I? And so that's sort of an idea that I would put forth to you to try and think about some of the history that we're seeing in that light. And so with polytheism in particular, it's useful to try and imagine what kind of conception of the individual is necessary, what kind of conception of the gods, is necessary to be able to see the world in the way that a polytheist would see the world, where the gods were very much out there in the world, infused in the sacredness of nature, such that nature was itself a sacred thing, not just a physical thing, and that the gods could take you over, could possess you, and drive you to different things. And this is perhaps not unreasonable when we see that a lot of the gods are manifestations in fairly clear forms of different emotions. And one can point to the strongest of the different aspects of what it means to be human in terms of love, Aphrodite, anger, Vulcan, Ares, and so on and so on and so on, desire and divinity and memory and sleep and so on, where one is not just viewing a world that is infused with the gods at all times, but one's own identity is infused with the divine at all times. And so the experience of memory, the experience of sleep, the experience of love and sadness and lust and anger and all the other things that make us human is something that is intimately tied with the divine. And so this view of life as divine in all ways, both the interior life and the exterior life, is, I think, very different than the way that we see the world now.